Good afternoon, everyone. I think we can begin. I just want to get a notion of how much you know ASP.NET 5. Who's been to the session this morning about ASP.NET 5, the one that presented the framework itself, the project system in Visual Studio, less about the code itself, which I'm going to talk about? Okay. Everyone else already heard some kind of session about ASP.NET 5? Or will you be amazed when I show you that there is no web config anymore? Okay. Okay, so embrace yourself. Okay, so first of all, an important thing about this session, as you are all aware, ASP.NET 5 MVC 6 hasn't been released yet. And no, I'm not a Microsoft employee, so I can't tell you when it's going to be. But I can tell you that currently, the version that you have in Visual Studio 2015 is known as Beta 3. There is already Beta 4. As the product manager of ASP.NET told me a couple of days ago, Beta 3 is already old, but that's what we have in Visual Studio. So basically what I want to tell you is that this entire presentation may be irrelevant in a couple of days as beta versions come out. I actually had to update this entire slide deck, including my demos, because I updated from Beta 2 to Beta 3 a couple of weeks ago, and nothing worked. I also presented a similar session a couple of months ago, and just upgraded from Beta 1 to Beta 2, and nothing worked. So now that I'm saying that this entire thing is buggy and you shouldn't use it, you should just be careful when you update your Visual Studio to the new CTPs. Do it carefully, and by no way should you use this framework in production. Okay, so promise me, don't use it in production until it is released officially. I assume sometime this year, because they won't release 2015 with a beta version of ASP.NET in it. So, a bit about myself, in case you haven't been to any of my other sessions or workshops that I had in this conference. My name is Ido Flatow. I'm a consultant from Israel from a company called Sela Group. And the reason I'm doing a lot of work with ASP.NET recently, ASP.NET 5 especially, is because we're actually writing the ASP.NET 5 course for Microsoft. These days, I'm assuming it will take a couple of months and then another couple of weeks to update the course because of all the beta versions. I used to do a lot of work with ASP.NET. In the last couple of years, it's mostly in Web API, but I even developed in web forms. So yeah. By the way, there is no web forms in ASP.NET 5. I don't know if the speaker in the morning mentioned that. Probably not. Okay. So what are we going to see here today? I'm not going to discuss what ASP.NET 5 is. I'm assuming you saw that in the morning. I'm not going to discuss the new project system in ASP.NET or what is the KVM or the DNVM that replaced it or what the K command line does. I might show it, okay, but unless we have 3 hours, anyone wants to stay here till 7? No, okay. Yeah, someone? Okay, so we can talk about that if you want. But what we are going to talk about is MVC 6 itself, how to use MVC 6 to create both user interface and APIs, and what has changed between the old days, which are the current days, of ASP.NET 4.5 to ASP.NET 5. So first of all, a bit about .NET, the ecosystem, and 2015, what is going on. So first of all, today we have actually 2 versions of .NET. .NET 4.5 is already old. 4.51 and 4.52 are also already old. We have 4.6. 4.6 is the one that you will use for developing your current applications. It can be WPF, WinForms, ASP.NET. If you're still using 4.5, you can just upgrade to 4.6. It has the same ecosystem, the same .NET framework, only an update to the .NET framework. But on the other hand, you have the .NET Core 5. Okay, .NET Core 5 allows you to use ASP.NET and a new versions of .NET which are native code. It has the ability to run ASP.NET 5 on Mac and Linux. You can still, by the way, use ASP.NET 5 in .NET 4.6, okay? But eventually, I'm guessing that if you're aiming at cross-platform, you'll want to compile your ASP.NET projects into the .NET Core itself and not necessarily to the .NET Framework. That will basically allow you to take your application with the .NET Framework, place it on a flash drive, and run it even from a server that doesn't have the .NET, the most recent version of .NET installed on top of it. Now, both of these frameworks, both 4.6 and the .NET Core, use some common components. Again, as explained in the morning, I think you saw this exact slide. We have the runtime with the new JIT and the new Roslyn compiler. We have the NuGet packages that allow us to download new versions of .NET and place them as NuGet packages in our code. So when I publish my application, it's not only my own DLLs and the assemblies that I get for Entity Framework and MVC. It's now also getting the DLLs for .NET as a NuGet package. Okay, amazing. Running side by side, multiple versions on the same server. But first, we have to go through the obstacle of convincing IT to upgrade our servers to .NET 4.6. Okay. Think of how much time it took you to convince them to upgrade .NET 4 to .NET 4.5. Now you have to do the same from 4.5 to 4.6, and then you'll have this wonderful, ideal world, this utopic world of running side by side with .NET. So when we use ASP.NET, by the way, again, this session is about MVC and Web API and web pages. It's not about web forms. Web forms did not find itself in ASP.NET 5. They did not migrate this framework, mostly because it was very old. It had a lot of coupling to ASP.NET, the old ASP.NET to IIS. It didn't have too much capabilities of dependency injection and that sort of stuff, so it was really hard migrating into ASP.NET 5. And I'm assuming that Microsoft just, calculated that probably a lot of people are in the process of migrating to MVC, so they just didn't bother of migrating into ASP.NET 5. But it doesn't says that it doesn't mean that web forms is dead. On the contrary, they just updated web forms to web forms 4.6. So you have support for HTTP2 and multiple other stuff in web forms. Okay, so it's not dead. It's still there, just won't find itself to the newest version, but you can always keep using it in 4.6. So, with a show of hands, how many people are using MVC? Okay, how many people are using web APIs? How many people are using web pages? Yeah, I thought so. You're multiplying, okay. If we look at web pages, by the way, most of you aren't using web pages, so just to clarify, web pages is a sort of a Razor plus mixed code. Okay, it's a Razor with C# code in it, C# code that is supposed to call a backend service, get the data, and then create the HTML. It's just like having controller and view in a controller. Okay, so Razor is a common part in both web pages and MVC, but in web pages we had mixed code. In MVC we had only Razor. We didn't do a lot of mixed code, so there is some difference between Razor and web pages and MVC. By the way, this is prior to 5, of course. The HTML helpers are a bit different between web pages and MVC. In MVC and in Web API, we have controllers, right? But there are different names, controller and API controller. They come from different assemblies, right? The system.net.http and system.web.mvc. We have actions, of course, but in MVC, actions return what? An iActionResult, right? And in Web API, we can return all sorts of types, complex types, HTTP response messages, that sort of thing. So it's basically the same concept of controller and action, but it's written differently. Filters, we have both in MVC and Web API. and some of them are even named the same, authentication filter, action filter, but in each of the frameworks, they originate from different assemblies, so they have different namespaces. So if you want to create a filter for both frameworks, you actually need to duplicate it and place it in a second class with a different, using namespace. Also, the model binding is almost the same for both MVC and Web API, but for Web API, we have all of those formatters that we can customize. We can customize the model binding. MVC is a bit more restricted to what it can do, but again, this is just duplicated code between the two environments, okay? And both MVC and Web API has some sort of a dependency injection mechanism. In MVC, it's more simple. In Web API, it's a bit more, let's say, embracing. Okay, you can have your own dependency injection mechanisms, your own IOC containers in Web API, but there is a lot of difference between MVC and Web API, unfortunately, in the current version of .NET. In the new version of .NET, it's all MVC. So web pages basically gone, okay? MVC and Web API is still exists in ASP.NET 5, but it's just now called MVC, okay? Model view controller, but this time this view can be either an HTML view, but it can also be a JSON content. It can also be an XML content, and you can write the same controller to manage both Web API and MVC, okay? So what does MVC 6 provide us? So first of all, no more duplication. The controller class, you only have one controller class that you need to derive from, whether you're creating a set of APIs or whether you're creating a user interface. If you need to create an action filter, if you need to create a dependency resolver, you write it once for both MVC and Web API. If you want to migrate, for example, from web pages to MVC, it's quite easy to take that mixed code and put it out into a controller. Both MVC and Web API use the pipeline of ASP.NET 5. So, for example, if you had message handlers that were just for Web API and you created the same message handlers for MVC, then now you can just create those Owin-like components. I'm saying Owin-like because it's not really Owin anymore in MVC 5, but it's a middleware concept just like Owin. How many people are familiar with Owin for ASP.NET? Owin? Owin is the pipeline that is intended to replace the IIS pipeline. In IIS, we have different modules that we have, right, for static files, for compression, for logging, for security. Owin was the thought of, we want to decouple ASP.NET from IIS, so let's invent a new pipeline. So they invented a set of interfaces that mock up a pipeline where you can have your own static file management and compression management, caching management, and eventually disconnect the whole ASP.NET stack from IIS. That's why you probably noticed that we have Web API, which is self-hosted. We can self-host Web API services. With MVC 6, we can also self-host MVC applications. So if you want a user interface that doesn't use IIS, you can do that with the new pipeline. Actually, I have no idea why you would want to do that, because what's wrong with IIS? Well, I'm an IIS MVP, so I'm supposed to say that. But you can do that with the new ASP.NET 5 pipeline. Now, someone asked me before about, is it possible to change some of the components of MVC? The entire pipeline of MVC is built on dependency injection. Even MVC itself, all the components of MVC itself, all the default formatters, the JSON formatter, the XML formatters, all the various authentication, authorization filters, all the default stuff are there not because they are default, but because they are injected by default into the pipeline. If you want, you can just pull them out and put stuff of your own in the pipeline by injecting new stuff to the pipeline, okay? So the entire MVC, and we'll see that later on today, is built on top of dependency injection, and it's quite easy to create your own components and inject them into controllers and other stuff. As I mentioned just now, MVC 6 doesn't run only on IIS. It runs on self-hosted environments. By the way, self-hosted not only in Windows, but also on Mac, on Linux, anywhere you can run the Mono framework. Okay? Currently, it's the Mono framework. Later, when the core CLR will be compiled to also support Mac and Linux, we'll also be able to run that on the core CLR instead of Mono. Okay? So if you've seen this morning's session, there is, for example, a special web listener called Kestrel. Kestrel can run, it's a C application, C, you know, the language C. A C application that provides you with a web listener, and that application is multi-platform, cross-platform. It can run on a Windows, on a Linux, on a Mac, and we will actually see that today to host the application, and I'm demoing the same application on various platforms. And one of the things that at least I'm happy about, the new .NET, the new ASP.NET 5 has really improved the pipeline that it uses in order to manage requests. I don't know how many of you had the chance of looking at how much memory ASP.NET 4.5 uses to handle incoming requests. I'm actually showing it tomorrow in my troubleshooting workshop. It's about a couple of, not a couple of Ks, but close to 100K just to store in memory the HTTP context object that you have for each and every one of the requests. Officially, the number is 30K, but from tests that I did, it's closer to 100 if you take into account all the data that you pass into the action method. In HTTP 5, they lowered that number by a whole lot, by about 90-something%. It's about 3K now instead of 30K. So it's very optimized into scenarios where you have to serve thousands of requests in your application. So that's basically ASP.NET 5 and MVC 6. So how do you begin using MVC 6? First of all, how many of you have never seen that file called project.json? I want to know because I want to see if I need to open Visual Studio first before showing this. Okay, so let me just start by opening Visual Studio. Visual Studio 2015, I have here an MVC 5 project. And the first thing that you notice when I open an MVC 5 project, there is no web config file anymore. There is no, actually, if I show you the file system, you won't even see a CSPorge file. Okay, there is no CSPorge file. Everything is managed. Everything relating to references and configuration is managed in this single project.json file. This is an error that happens ever since the latest CTP, so just ignore that. And this JSON file contains all there is to know about this application in regards to what it needs to know when it's running. So the most important part here is the dependencies part. Dependencies are the replacement of references. So add a reference basically means add a dependency now. I can add that just through editing this bunch of JSON content. I can also, of course, just right-click the references here and choose Manage NuGet Packages and manage it from the NuGet Package window. Let's just zoom out a bit. Okay, it's a new NuGet Package management window. One of the coolest features that I like is that finally we have the option to choose an earlier version of a NuGet package. Hopefully something that doesn't have any breaking changes in comparison to the new ones. So as you can see here, there are a bunch of important dependencies that you must have if you want to use MVC. First one, if you're going to use IIS, you need to have, there's a problem here with the lightning. You need to have the server IIS if you want to be hosted under IIS. MVC is the dependency that you must have in order to use MVC. By the way, as you can see, I'm specifically currently using beta 3. I can try to use beta 4, but since Visual Studio 2015, the current CTP ships with beta 3, I decided not to upgrade to a too much advanced framework, just so you won't get confused and seeing stuff that maybe won't work on your own machines. Okay, so I'm using beta 3. As I said, current version is beta 4. As you can see, we also have another dependency here for static files. Now I'm running under IIS, so I don't actually need this dependency. But since I already configured this application to run both on IIS and on a self-hosted environment, I do want to have the ability to handle static files, although I won't even get those requests inside my pipeline because IIS will serve them before I get a chance to see them. Okay, so I'm placing it here just because, as you can see, I have the option to run it on a web listener for Windows or for a Kestrel listener, which will run on both this Windows and my Mac. Okay, here's my Mac, by the way. Here's my Windows. So as you can see, there are a whole bunch of settings here, including the framework and folders to include when doing a build, but that's less relevant for this session. So the first thing you'll need to do is to include that dependency for MVC 6 in your project JSON. If you create a project from the template and you specify that it's MVC 6, it will create it automatically, but if you create an empty one, you'll need to add that manually, okay? You'll get IntelliSense showing you exactly which versions are available. Don't worry there, you don't have to type it by hand. That's why we have IntelliSense for. The second part that you will need to do is to actually hook up MVC into the pipeline. Now, as I explained before, the ASP.NET pipeline uses dependency injection and it's customizable. So if I'm not going to do MVC, if I'm just going to create a static website, I can basically create an ASP.NET 5 application that doesn't have any notion of MVC. Okay? Just by adding this app.use MVC, I'm actually injecting several components into the pipeline that will know how to handle MVC requests, that will know how to check the URLs to figure out if they match a URL of a specific template and activate a specific controller. Without this command, I won't have MVC in my code. Just like, by the way, you have the web API configuration, for example, and the MVC configuration. But even if you don't put MVC configuration in ASP.NET 4.5, you still have MVC, right? It just won't respond to any template rule. Without use MVC, you won't have any MVC code in your application. The second part, as you can see after use MVC, is to call another method, services.addMVC. Services.addMVC, this one here at the bottom, we'll see this exactly in a minute in the code. This one will actually invoke the dependency injection mechanism and will register a lot of the default classes of MVC to the MVC configuration. So for example, without calling services.addMVC, I won't be able to get a response as a JSON because the JSON formatter is part of the DI configuration that MVC has to apply. Okay? It looks for an I formatter, an I input, and an I output formatter. Services.addMVC will register the JSON formatter. If I want, I can override that code and write some stuff of my own to inject my own configuration of MVC. Okay? So when is this code executed? It's executed once the web listener starts, and it has to run a specific class called startup.cs, which I'll show in a second. So as you can see, another file that we have that I just mentioned, the startup.cs. You might be familiar with startup.cs if you're using ASP.NET 5 and Owin. How many people noticed that startup.cs in their code? Okay, so if you use Owin, if you created any project using the ASP.NET 4.5 template, you got this class which is called startup.cs, and this class is invoked automatically when your server starts. So if it's IIS, it's when the worker process starts. If I will run it from command line, once the web listener starts, it will execute this code. And what this code does is just the things that I explained. Okay, so first of all, let's go to the bottom one. So as you can see, I have here a call to use static files. This will actually hook up the middleware. That's how it's called not in Owen, but in the new MVC5 pipeline. The static file middleware to handle calls for static files, and they use MVC for calls to MVC. And just like before, we have that map route. There are a couple of differences in the map route between how we used to do them in 4.5 and how we do them in ASP.NET 5. We'll talk about that shortly. But as you can see, I'm just using the use MVC here. There is a separate method just above called configure services. This is also a method that is being called by the pipeline. And here you can see the line that I showed in the slide, services.mvc. Okay, so it's two calls, each method in a different public void method. And as you can see here, I'm also deep diving and configuring my own MVC settings. For example, one thing that you should know about the new MVC6, MVC6, at least from beta 3 and on, doesn't have the XML serializer built into the default pipeline. So as I said, when I do services.mvc, it adds the JSON serializer. It doesn't add the XML serializer. If you want to add the XML serializer, you have to do it on your own. Okay? If you want to register your own filters, you do it from here. So first, use MVC. Second, use services, not services, sorry, add MVC to the services. I mentioned that there is a difference in how we build templates between ASP.NET 4.5 and MVC 5 and ASP.NET 5 and MVC 6. Too many numbers, right? Let's see, we're on the same line. ASP.NET 4.5, which version of MVC is it? 5. ASP.NET 5 is MVC 6, okay? So just to be clear, we'll be skipping between these two versions. So let's just call it MVC 5 and MVC 6, okay? That should be clearer and without involving ASP.NET, just MVC 5 and MVC 6. So in MVC 6, we can do several things with those routing templates, and mainly that's setting constraints, optional parameters, and default values. So these are things you might have noticed, for example, in various NuGet packages that you can download for MVC and for Web API, stuff that came out in Web API, for example, afterwards in Web API 2. So you can do stuff like specify that a parameter is of a certain type, an alphanumeric one or a number. You can specify parameters that are optional, which will translate in your actions probably to a nullable value. Okay? You can specify default values if you don't want to have two different methods, one with a default value, meaning without a value, and you set it in the code, and one for a parameter that actually has a value. So this structure is available both when you use the map route command and when you use, and we'll see that shortly, when you use the route attribute for Web APIs. Okay? And that's something that I'm going to discuss, why we have these two ways of configuring routes and why we have to use both. We can't choose one, we have to use both. Now, just to point out, throughout the slides, I sometimes have links that will show you where these things are configured and where the code that, of ASP.NET that contains the code related to those things is in GitHub. So the slides are at the bottom usually. You can just go ahead and, for example, see the classes in ASP.NET, in MVC, to be more precise, that manage the routing mechanism. That's the beauty of having a source code. You can just go ahead and see how it was implemented in MVC and see exactly what's available for you there. Okay, so not on every slide, but on every 2 or 3 slides, you'll see a link that shows exactly how it was implemented. So, first of all, regarding Web API configuration, you saw, for example, that I added a filter in the startup CS. So you might think, okay, do I have that Web API config that I had before in MVC 5? No, you don't have that file anymore. The configuration itself has been broken down to several locations. So first of all, if you need to have any routing configuration, and in Web API we usually have at least the default one, API/controller, right? You can't use map route for that anymore. It doesn't work. So let me just zoom out. So this one here, the technique of using map route, can only be used for stuff like MVC, for user interface, okay? If you want stuff that look like APIs, stuff that you can send a GET request and invoke a method that starts with GET, if you want to send a POST request and invoke a method that starts with POST or has the attribute HTTP POST, then you have to use the route attribute. Something that looks like so. Okay, let's look at this one. So, first of all, if you have a controller that is going to be an API controller, not derived from an API controller, but is going to be designated to be an API controller, it's going to return a JSON, we'll have to use the route attribute to decorate it. Let me just zoom in a bit. To decorate the class and to define how that route will look like. Okay, we can't use the map route anymore. As you can see, the brackets there, they're not curly brackets. That's because this is how we specify that in runtime, it will just replace the name of the controller with the name of the class. Okay, that actually allows us not to mention the name of the class in the route itself, just controller, and it will replace it in runtime. So API/products will hit this class. Okay, it will make this class getting created and one of the actions invoked. As you can see now, we have for the verbs the HTTP GET, HTTP POST. There should be a post here somewhere. Here you go. For the HTTP POST, we can set the specific, let's call it sub routes. Okay, so it will be API/products/find/the product name. Okay, you have to use these settings. You have to use HTTP GET. You have to use HTTP POST for the MVC 6 mechanism to know that you're actually trying to hit this method according to a verb and not according to only a URL as you would have done in MVC 5. Okay. So these are two things to know about the routing mechanism. Second of all, everything that had to do with message handlers, also known as delegating handlers. Whoever created message handlers in Web API? Anyone? Anyone? Never customized the Web API pipeline? No? Okay. So in Web API, in MVC, not MVC, but in Web API 2, you could create a message handler. The name of the class is delegating handler. You derived from that, and you got a class that can actually see the incoming request and outgoing response, and you can just check it, change it, do whatever you want with it. Okay. In MVC 6, you don't have that option anymore. If you want to create a piece of code that looks at messages as they're coming in and the responses as they're going out, you have to write a middleware. Okay. Please note, I'm not saying OWIN middleware because MVC 6 and ASP.NET 5 is not based on the OWIN middleware. As I understand, OWIN wasn't good enough, so they had to improve it. They didn't want to wait for the developers of OWIN to update their interfaces, so they just created a new OWIN. Okay, so just call it from now on the ASP.NET middleware. Okay, no OWIN anymore. So message handler is one piece of Web API that went away. If you want to have filters or formatters, how many people wrote action filters for Web API or for MVC? Yeah? Okay, so now you have a centralized location to add filters and formatters into, into MVC 6, and that's in that method that I showed in the startup CS that manages the services, the dependency injection. Okay, so if you want, for example, to add a XML formatter, you add that in the use services. If you want to configure a filter, you do that in the same method. Again, it looks something like so, okay? So services.configure MVC options. By the way, this line changed from beta 2 to beta 3. So if you look up online, you probably see less documentation about MVC options. You probably see stuff like services.use MVC options. It was changed, the method name has changed. So here I'm adding a formatter and adding a filter. In this case, this is the filter that I wrote. Should look familiar. If you look at the filter, okay, this is a standard action filter, right? On action executed, on action executing. This is a validation filter, so what I'm doing is just checking the model state, checking if it's valid. Okay, this is all classic MVC 5 Web API 2 stuff. Okay, I haven't done anything new, but the newest thing here is that this one now applies to both user interface and for services. Okay, so write it once, use it in both environments. As for, by the way, the formatters, has anyone ever written a formatter? No one's ever written a formatter for CSV or for stuff like that? Okay. Formatter, just like JSON and XML formatters, we could have written formatters even back at MVC 5 and Web API 2. But in those days, it was last week, you know, in those days, we created a single code file that did both the reading of the content from the request and the writing of the content to the response. Okay, we both deserialize and serialize the content. As of MVC 6, you actually need to create two classes. There's an I input formatter and an I output formatter. Okay, so for example, this method add XML data contact serializer formatter just sends two calls to the dependency injection, add the input formatter for data contact serializer, add an output formatter for data contact serializer. Okay? If you want, you can just grab the code from GitHub and make sure that I'm telling the truth. So, controllers, both for API and both for UI, let's call it UI, we use the same class called controller from which we derive. Okay? So in the upper block, we can see an index method returning an lActionResult and returning a view. Looks familiar? Yeah, that's basically MVC 5, right? Nothing has changed. The most significant change is in the API part, what was once known as Web API. So first of all, we're not deriving from API controller, normal API controller. It's the same controller class, but as I mentioned before, we have to use those routing mechanisms. As for the method itself, nothing has changed. I don't have to return an lActionResult with a JSON result as we once did maybe in MVC. Because we have the same concepts here of Web API, we can just return a product, an IEnumerable, stuff like that. What we can't return is an HTTP response message. Has anyone ever returned an HTTP response message from MVC? Yeah, from Web API, sorry? Yeah, so you can't do that anymore. There are other ways to do that, okay? So we actually saw the demo, but let's just run this and make sure that it actually works. So what do we have here? First of all, let me zoom out a bit. All of you in the back, just let me know, do you see this code or should I zoom in a bit? Is that okay from the back? Zoom in? Okay. I just need to know if I need 120 zoom or, is that better? No? Yeah, better? 130, okay. So, back to my products controller. This is an API controller. So I don't have the API here. I have the route. I have methods that return stuff like IEnumerable product, which is just fine. Okay. I'm not doing anything out of the ordinary that you didn't see in Web API 2. I just have the attribute that says if this is a get or a post. Okay. By the way, using get by name wouldn't have made a difference because they removed the whole convention stuff that we had in Web API. the whole convention over configuration is relevant to other stuff like the name of the controller, but not for identifying which action needs to be invoked. Okay, that has changed. That has actually ruined one of my demos once. In a conference, wanted to show, hey, here is how MVC 6 works. And no, didn't work like that anymore because they changed the convention stuff between beta 1 and beta 2. Okay, so we have here a simple get method. But this time, this method is not returning a product. It's returning an lActionResult. So here we can see, for example, a mix of code that we used to write in MVC with code that we used to write in Web API. So it's an API method because it returns eventually an object, so it's going to be serialized into something. But I'm returning it as an lActionResult. Okay? So I can return stuff like object result. I can return stuff like complex types. I can return all sorts of things. We'll see in just a minute which types exactly I can return from a UI application and from an API application. Now let's make sure it actually works. Let's run this. So I'm running it under IS Express right now. This line is actually part of an MVC UI controller. If you look at this one here, this one is sent back because I'm currently hitting the root, which means controller home action index. Let's go and see that one. Okay, this is basically an MVC controller. Index returning, sorry, it should return a view, not a view result, but let's ignore that for now. Let's do this. Forgot to do something in my code. Let's do that. Okay. Let's see that it still runs. Yeah. So you might have noticed that it even ran when it didn't derive from controller, which is a new thing in MVC, okay, which we'll talk about in about 10 minutes. But as you can see, this is a basic UI controller, lActionResult, return a view. That view looks quite the same as we did before. We'll actually talk about views later on, okay? Just a normal view for a controller. Let's call the API products. So click here. And as you can see, I'm calling API/products, and I'm currently hitting this method. Not the ID one, but this one. Okay? As you can see, there's also another command here that I will show later, where I'm actually forcing this method to return a JSON with, regardless of whether the browser asked for XML or JSON. Okay, that's just my way to say to people who are still using XML, go yourself. Okay, sorry. So how do we write actions in API? By the way, I'm less talking about writing for UI, writing MVC for UI, because nothing has really changed in how we write MVC code for UI. It will still be an lActionResult returning a view. Okay, nothing has changed in that aspect. A lot of the things which were changed in how we write APIs. Okay, so that's why it seems like a lot of this content is about APIs, but don't worry, I'm also getting to the point where I'm talking about views. Okay, so we'll see some Razor stuff. So, as I explained before, we can actually return an lActionResult. What can I do with an lActionResult? I can, for example, return stuff like HTTP not found or object result. Methods that create a new class of HTTP not found or object result classes that represent messages. How many people seen the iHTTP result or whatever it was called in Web API 2? The ability to create a class that represents a message that you return to a client. It was available ever since, I think, Web API 2.1 or something like that. It allows you to write classes that represent responses in order to reuse them. So if you are writing, for example, cache headers in all of your responses, You don't need to do that manually in every one of the methods. You just write a class that says cacheable response. You create a new class, a new object of that class, and return that object. Okay. So the same goes here. I can create new classes. These classes are already supplied by the framework. So if I want to return a message that says not found in HTTP 3 or 4, just return an HTTP not found, call this method. It will generate, it will create that object, and will return a matching message. If I want to return a JSON representing an object, just return an object result. And it's the same, by the way, as just changing the return value from lActionResult to, say, what is it here? An item object. In addition, I have, for example, the option to return a created route. How many people are writing post methods for Web API and not just get methods? How many people of you ever written post? So I don't know how many people ever read the HTTP guidelines, the RFC of HTTP, but according to the HTTP guidelines, if you are being called via post, it's common courtesy to return an HTTP 201 response, not a 200, and specify the location where the resource that you manipulated is, can be now retrieved from. So if I'm posting a new entity, I'm supposed to get a response saying HTTP 201. 201 means created. And I'm supposed to get a special HTTP header called location, pointing to the location where I can now get this entity. Anyone did that? Okay. Some of you are not behaving nicely in regards to the HTTP RFC at least. So as you can see, let's just remove the circle. I'm returning a created route, specifying the name of the route. If you notice, I'm just pointing to the getById method, and I'm saying, please create a location header to point out to the get with the ID of the item. This will basically just create a URL, localhost/API/products/7, okay? And place it in a in a location header and send it back to the client. Let's try and see how that works. Should have this method here. Okay, this is the same method. Posting a product. Let's try that with Fiddler. Okay, first of all, let's get one of the products. Let's grab that from Fiddler. And what? Let's just do the following. Oh, sorry, I want a response. Oh, sorry for sure. This is a post one. You can also do it with Postman if people prefer Postman. Let's post it to products. And of course, this content type is a JSON, so let's just write that. And should be enough, okay? So I got a 201 response created, and the location is now API/products/6. If I do that again, should get now 7, okay? So that's how you're supposed to write a response for a post request, just, general concept, so you'll know. So I can also use stuff like created route. It will automatically fetch that route data, create that URL, create a response with a 201, and place that header in the URL. Okay, URL in the header, sorry. So what kind of responses can we send out of an lActionResult? So for APIs, we have a bunch of them like bed request is an HTTP 400. Content result, if you want to return just strings. Created a route, which we just saw. An HTTP status code result, which you can specify the status code that you want to respond with. JSON result, if you know that you're going to respond with a JSON. Object result, if you want the formatter to decide what to do, whether it's XML or JSON. For UI, you have the same stuff that we had before, partial view, redirect, view, or even, again, the JSON option. For both of them, for example, if you're doing, if you're doing security, you might want to return a challenge result. Challenge is a 401. HTTP not found, of course. File content if you want to respond with a file and not necessarily with an XML or a JSON. This entire set of result objects, again, you can find them on GitHub, and you can see exactly which types there are. You can figure out which parameters they get in order to understand how to better use them, okay? So I mentioned a couple of times about formatters and the fact that the MVC 6 now only supports JSON and not XML. So let me try and explain how that actually works in MVC 6. So first of all, MVC still respects the accept header. If I tell it accept XML, it will try to figure out if it has an XML formatter. It just doesn't have one by default, so it will respond with JSON. But if I included that, just like I showed you in the code, it will work. Okay, so for example, if we go back here, and let's grab this one. Let me just make sure this is not the one that has the producers. Yeah. If I grab this one to Composer and say accept application XML, so this should return an XML, okay? If I say application JSON, or just remove that because it's a default, I will get a JSON, okay? So this still works, hasn't been changed, only the XML is currently not by default. I can, of course, force my code to return a specific type. So for example, we don't have an XML result, but we do have a JSON result. Doesn't take much to write an XML result, by the way. You can just return a JSON result, or as you saw in my code, I can use the produces attribute to force a specific content type, which will then, of course, the specific formatter will have to be applied. Okay, I'm just saying which type. I haven't serialized my content into that type yet. So if I write here application XML, but I didn't include XML, it will just fall back to JSON. Okay. So for example, for that one, it was for the product. So even if I specify XML here, okay, XML, let's execute that. Let's check that. Okay. So even if I specified XML and it still returned the JSON object, just because I used that produces attribute to force my code to use JSON. There has been several additional changes to how those methods work, those action methods work. So first of all, if you are returning a string, if your return value is of type string, it won't create a JSON. It will just return text plain. So be careful about migrating existing code from MVC 5 to MVC 6, to be more exact, from Web API to MVC 6, because usually string was returned as a JSON, and now it will be returned as a plain text. If your method returns a null value, so you had an action result, but you returned a null value, or if your method returned a void in the first place, this will actually result in an HTTP 204. HTTP 204 means no content. It's an empty message. There is a bug in the current version that you have, which is beta 3. Let me show you this code. Okay, so for example, I have a void method here. So it will automatically return an HTTP 204. But let's say I want to do some, validations here. I want to see if the ID that is sent in this parameter is identical to the ID in the product, just to make sure everything is okay. So if I do this, and to be more specific, I'll do this, okay? I'll here want to return something else, but it's void, so I can't return. I can maybe use HTTP response message, but there is no HTTP response message. So what I can do is I can actually go to this, to the context, to the response and set the status code. So I can do something like this. Okay, status code equals 400. There's a bad argument, and return this to the client side. In CTP, in the current CTP you have in Visual Studio, which uses beta 3, this won't work because the formatter that applies to void, the formatter that sees that it's void, will actually automatically return 204. It won't look at the status code. It's already been fixed in beta 4. In beta 4, it will check if you set a status code and will return that status code instead. Problem is, you either need to manually upgrade your .NET framework to beta 4, or just wait for the next CTP or the RC, whichever comes first, I'm guessing in a couple of weeks. So you can do that, but if I'll try to run that, you'll still see me getting 204 all the time. So no point in trying that out. Okay, so we saw a bit about MVC controllers. I think we can skip the demo slide. In this morning session, there was mentioning that MVC 6 now supports dependency injection. That's true, and it's very easy to implement. First of all, how many people are familiar with dependency injection in general? Ooh, all of you. Okay. Let's see. How many people are using stuff like Ninject? Anyone? Castle? Okay. Unity? Okay. Any other thing I haven't mentioned? Structure map? Yeah. Okay. Great. So all of these are IOC containers, right? Dependency injection mechanisms. ASP.NET 5 invented their own. But that's okay. There is also code here in the dependency injection library on GitHub. There is also code that shows how to replace the default dependency injection, the simple dependency injection, let's call it that ships with ASP.NET 5 with known IOC containers like the ones I mentioned. So all of those, Unity, Ninject, Structure Map, Castle, they all have sample codes in this folder so you can see how to replace it with your own dependency injection. But just in case you didn't raise your hand to any of my questions and you are not using dependency injection, you can use the built-in dependency injection in order to inject your own classes into controllers. So for example, let's look at the code. As you can see, I have a controller here that in the constructor receives an interface. Okay, usually without an interface, we would have initialized that inside the constructor itself or try somehow to replace the controller invoker base class or something like that. But with dependency injection, it's very easy. Create the interface, set the interface in the constructor, and register which type you want to have for that interface, just like the line of code that is written below. Okay, so
you have multiple implementation of our product repository. Can we then specify which implementation we want to register?
The question is if I can say, for example, for a products controller, give me this, and for a different controller, give me something else. Not that I saw, but again, if you have that feature in structure map or other DIs, so you can just use those. Okay. So in my services method, as you recall, this method is part of the startup.cs. I'll just write code there that says DI container, please add a transient instance. Transient means that on every request, whenever an iProduct repository is required, please create a new default product repository. Okay? You have options such as transient, scoped, singleton, the various options that we have in almost every IOC container. Sorry. Okay, so in the code, if you look at it, I have here, for example, a product repository that I'm initializing on my own, but I can just go ahead and create a constructor. Now, let's keep that. Just change that to an iProduct repository. okay, and get that as a parameter. Of course, it would be recommended to check if it's not null or stuff like that, for an exception, blah, 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 you know, clean code, unit testing, that sort of stuff. Don't need to actually compile. You all know that I don't need to compile in MVC 6, right? I just need to save. No more Control-Shift-B, although I do it automatically, so it will take me a lot of time to persuade myself not to do that. So we can just save that, and the code will run just the same. Let me see. Oh, wait a minute. I'm not sure I registered that. Probably registered that for a different controller. Let's see if I have that registered. Should have, otherwise it wouldn't have worked. Here you go. I have the transient iProduct repository to products repository. I had this because I think I used that for my home controller. Let's see. Yeah, for my home controller, I already used that technique, so I had it registered, okay? But switching that wasn't a problem. So DI is very easy in MVC 6, and it's not just for a controller to provide stuff like repositories and such. It also allows you to actually create a controller without deriving from the controller class, okay? So first of all, the mechanism of locating the controller doesn't necessarily need to find a class that derives from controller. It just means you have to specify the controller suffix in your class name, and that's enough for it to find it. What you do need, what you will probably need, is to inject the properties like view data, action context, inject those properties into this class, because you get them automatically once you derive from controller, but if you don't derive from controller, you'll have to inject those properties. You inject them by adding them, of course, and using the activate attribute, which again wasn't necessary in the previous beta, and therefore my code didn't work in this beta. But now you have to specify the activate attribute for it to be injected. And that way, for example, as I showed you before, I can go back to my home controller now, remove this, okay, add the view data that I need, and in the lActionResult, I can't call the view method anymore because that comes from the base controller class. Instead, I'll return a new view result, okay, and that will use, sorry, and that will use the view data that I have here, okay. I had to give it somehow. Oh, I don't actually need that anymore. Yeah, I had to for a previous demo. I don't actually need that anymore. Let's see if this works. I should be able to browse to the root without any problem, or not. Name view data does not exist. So yeah, we do need that. Oh yeah, I used that in a different location. Sorry, here. Use that here. Okay. This was just returning a standard view. This one is returning a view with a model. So when I call a view with a model, I need to create a view result and supply my view data and attach the model to that view data. I need that view model injected into my code. Okay. So let's get back to the slide. So I can use dependency injection to inject classes into my constructor. I can also use dependency injection to inject properties into my controller when I'm not even deriving from the controller class. So we saw a bit of the DI. So let's talk a bit about views, okay? Because, I mean, controllers is nice, but MVC is also views, not just controllers. So what has changed? So first of all, how many people used partial views in MVC 5? Okay, so partial views are cool. It's just like having, you know, a custom control in web forms, that is sort of. But there is a problem where we write the methods that return the partial view inside the controller itself. And we also always have to make sure they are marked as child action only or non-action or stuff like that, and prevent them from being returned as partial views to someone just calls them from a browser. Okay? So Microsoft understood that, or at least the ASP.NET team understood that they need to improve this feature somehow. So what they did is they actually changed the concept a bit, and instead of just using partial views, they are now using something that is called a view component. Okay? A view component works very similar like partial views. Let's go just to the code itself. The difference is that I'm actually creating a special class for that partial. That class needs to derive from view component. That class can actually be invoked using two techniques, either synchronous or asynchronous. So now if you have a partial view that actually needs to return a lot of data from somewhere, it doesn't have to cause your thread to hang while it's retrieving data from the database. You can actually do asynchronous calls from the view through the view result to the database and back. View component, sorry, not view result. So for example, the invoke method also has a version of an invoke async, if you want to implement that. And that invoke method is actually the partial view method. Get the data, return a partial view, only this time it's called just view. So partial view is now view component. The same concept, but only different. You can think of it as a mini controller of some sort. Also supports the dependency injection mechanism, so you don't have to derive from view component. You can just have it named something view component. So, as I said, synchronous or asynchronous. How is it used in the view itself? So, in the view itself, first of all, we need to create the partial view itself as a CSHTML file. To create that, we're not placing it in the controller folder anymore. Under the controller folder, I mean the view folder, and underneath it, the controller named after the folder, late in the evening. The folder named after the controller, okay, so for example, view, products, we have to create a folder named components, and under that components folder, the name of the view component, in my case, product details, and inside that, a default CSHTML file. It's called default. You can change that default name to something else, but by default, it's default. Nice. When you want to use this partial view, view component, whichever you like to call it, sorry, what happened to the slide? Oh, yeah. You just use the technique that is here. Instead of calling the HTML helper, HTML.partial or HTML.action, child, sorry, you just write component.invoke and the name of your view component. I know it's not that of strongly typed. Hopefully someday we also get strongly typed invocation of components, but that's how it is right now. And you can see, just pass the parameters afterwards into the method. Let's just view it with some colors in Visual Studio so it will be clear. So I have, for example, the product details view component, and that basically just gets a product and return a view for that product. A view, home, components, product details, default, that just prints the HTML display model for. Okay, that's standard MVC stuff. Okay, nothing new under the sun here. So in my view itself, in the product, okay, whenever someone clicks on a product, and we'll talk shortly what this stuff does. What I'm doing here, where's my controller? Product, sorry, here it is. Just component.invoke, product details, and the idea of the product that I want to show. Okay, that's just exactly how we've seen this stuff happen. Okay? No, that's not the one. That's also not the one. That's also not the one. What was the name of that thing? Products, yeah, products. What happened? Home products, sorry. Okay, so clicking on one of them, and this is the partial that we got, just the partial without anything else. Okay, going back here, another thing that you can do is use services with your views, just like we have the concept of services in MVC. You're familiar with the concept of services? A model usually calls, a model is usually the structure of the data that we want to present in the view, but we have to pull that model from somewhere, service usually. Instead of our controller calling a service directly, a web service for example, there is the concept of a service class in MVC that provides the access to all of those data resources. So it's usually a controller calls to a service component calls to a backend service, returns the data as a model object, and then the controller passes it into a view. So we were always able to call those services from the controller. Now we also have the option to call those services from a view, okay, if you want to directly communicate with the service itself. So this is more of, let's call it more of a technique for web pages maybe, but that also works for MVC and views. So what we do is we create a class that implements some sort of an interface. I just randomly created an interface, okay. iCatalog service that does something. This actually, yeah. Missing the code here that declares the iCatalog service, okay, but that's basically just an interface that I created. And we use the razor instruction for inject. Inject grabs that interface, uses the dependency injection mechanism to find the implementation of that iCatalog service, and provides it to the razor code via an object named catalog. Then I can just call this object from within my razor code just to call the service. Of course, I will need to register, for example, a transient, register my implementation of catalog service with the iCatalog service. Okay? So services is not a new concept, but the fact that I can now inject services into the view, that's the new concept. Okay? Last but not least, another feature that I don't know how shocking it's going to be for you to hear about it, called tag helpers, or as I call it, the return of web controls. What is tag helpers? So if you look at that sample code using HTML.begin form, this is how we did things in MVC 5, right? We're using Razor to initiate some kind of thing that will generate both HTML and JavaScript for us. And generate HTML with specific attributes inside the HTML element to point out to the exact URL we want to submit to, and other stuff like anti-forgery token and such. With MVC 6, we just need to write a simple form element and say, for example, ASP action is update product. Go ahead and figure out exactly where that action is in the controller and replace it with a submit with an action pointing to that URL. ASP anti-forgery equals true basically means when you are creating the form element, please add another hidden field in the form element with an anti-forgery token. So if you look at it, this looks a bit similar to two things. First of all, it looks a bit similar to the data URIs, data attributes, we have in HTML5, right? The stuff that we use in places like Angular and stuff like that. But it also looks awfully familiar from web forms, right? Just missing what was it? Server equals true, right, of web forms. So it's sort of the return of web forms, but not exactly. Web forms could do a whole lot more in our HTML than what this part of this component can do. So basically what tag helpers can do, they get the HTML element where they are positioned. So for example, a tag helper to generate this stuff is a tag helper that only applies to the form element. So I can only call these attributes from a form HTML element. And the tag attribute will only see this form element and the content inside that form element. Okay, it can't see anything outside the form element, unlike, for example, a web control we had in ASP.NET Web Forms. So it can only see that form and generate content for that form only. So it's kind of a web control because there is a bunch of backend code, C# code that creates HTML by hand, but it's very restricted in how much it can actually affect the entire page. Okay, so what kind of, for example, of helpers do we have? We have helpers, for example, for the anchor and for the form attribute, elements, stuff for link and select and text, stuff that will allow us to apply CSS styles to all of the elements, tag helpers that will allow us to have either a specific CSS or different CSS depending if we declared some kind of an environment variable, for example. We have stuff like the cache elements. Cache elements, you all know that there is no cache element in HTML, right? So this is a tag helper that actually replaces the cache element with something else. Basically what it does, for example, is whatever we write in the cache element, it stores it in the cache and then just outputs it into the HTML as raw text. So for example, let's see that in action. Inside this products view, I have here a cache element that expires after 5 seconds. And I'm outputting datetime now. So basically what it means is that it's going to output the date. Every time I refresh the view, it's going to get to this cache element. But instead of executing this code and using it, it will just take whatever is in the cache, at least for the next couple of seconds. So if you go back to the browser and press enter again, watch the time here. Okay. I'm refreshing, and eventually, I timed this, and it seems a bit more than 5 seconds for some reason. But every 5 seconds, it's updating the cache. But as you can see, if I look at the source code, there is no actual cache element here. Okay, it's just updating the text that is outputted to the view. Another thing, for example, the anchor tag helper, I can use stuff like ASP controller, ASP action, ASP route, and the name of the parameter that I want to create. And that will basically create something that looks like this. Okay? The name of the controller, the name of the action, and the ID parameter that is, just injected after the slash. So this is, by the way, the alternative of doing something like, let's zoom out a bit. Okay? Instead of doing something like this and having to specify the name of the controller, instead of having Razor mixed code in all our HTML, we're just using these data attributes, style of data attributes, to inject content into our HTML elements. Okay, so we have a bunch of these elements. There's also a URL here for GitHub that shows you exactly which elements you have. You can just check the code and see which attributes you can use because unfortunately there's still no IntelliSense for those attributes. By the way, to make this work, it's not in the slide, so it's very important. In the view start, if you're still using a view start, if you chose to use a view start, add this specific line of row, add tag helper. You can, instead of the view start, you can add that in the layout or in any one of your pages, but you have to, you need to use this specific instruction. Let me just zoom in a bit. Just so the razor mechanism, not the razor mechanism, the view engine mechanism will know to scan that assembly and see exactly which tag helpers it has and understand which elements to check those data attributes. Okay? So, last part. Where's the slide? Last demo. Everything that we just saw was on Windows. Time to try it on a Mac. Okay? Cross your fingers. So first of all, let me open a command line here and see if that will work. KVM, as you saw in the morning, is the runtime environment that shows me which versions I have installed. So KVM list, I have beta 3 installed. I didn't install beta 4. The DNVM, by the way, is the replacement of KVM. They changed it from ASP.NET 5 was called originally Project K. I assume they saw Men in Black and decided to call it Project K, I'm guessing. They eventually changed it from K virtual management to .NET virtual something, so it's DNVM. DNVM has beta 4 currently installed on my machine, but I'm not using it. I will keep using the KVM. So KVM use 100 beta 3. Okay, now I can run the K command that runs everything. K web, oh, not from here, of course, from here. Let me see if I have this folder. K web. K web will self-host this application locally inside Windows. So let's try this out. So instead of IS Express, I'll just go to port 5004, if I'm not mistaken. Just make sure of that. Web is 5000. Okay. And it works just the same. By the way, I can also run Kestrel from here because Kestrel won't load. I do have Kestrel here, right? Oh yeah, I need to specify the entire, no matter. We'll run it from the Mac. So I have my Mac here. This is the same code, by the way. Okay, if we go to, I don't know, to the controllers, and let's type the, what is it, VI? You do know how to use VI, right? Because I don't know how to exit that application. Sudo, stuff like that. Let me just close that. We have Sublime for those kind of things. You know? So it's the same code. I'm actually, my Mac and my Windows are sharing the same code. And I can just go here and open this with Sublime. Okay, same code. Let me just go to command line. And again, I have here KVM. This one is using Mono, of course, not the .NET CLR. K, this one can only use Kestrel. It can't use the web listener because that uses system.net.http, and that's the HTTP listener of Windows is not accessible in Mono. K Kestrel should run in a second. Browser, this one is 5002. Localhost 5000. Click here. Here are my APIs. Here is my MVC home. Okay. And here I can click that one, and of course have all that caching stuff. Refresh. Refresh is not working for some reason. Interesting. Probably, it works in the beta 4. It doesn't work in the beta 3. That's okay. That's probably the answer. But I'll check that. Probably a difference in how they implemented the in-memory cache in the .NET and in the Mono. But basically, as you saw, same code running without any problem on each and every one of the environments, except for Kestrel on my Windows, which didn't act as I expected, but that's okay. Just have to check that out. How can you continue to use MVC 6 in your application? So first of all, you need to install Visual Studio 2015. ASP.NET/vNext. vNext was the original name of ASP.NET 5. You can find out a lot of documentation, a lot of samples. I have to warn you, a lot of those samples are out of date. And if you try to copy that code, it probably won't even compile. But what you should do, you go to GitHub, to the ASP.NET/MVC repository, and there is a lot of sample code there that you can see, and that sample code is actually getting updated. And you can, of course, go ahead and check the source code of both MVC and ASP.NET and the DI framework and everything else. If you want to try a nightly build, please be careful. It's on you. And if you want to contact me, and by the way, this session is already online, so you can also grab that and all of the sample codes. And I already uploaded the code that we've seen here, so you can just grab that and see exactly how to write it in beta 3. I have to assume that in beta 4, there's probably 1 or 2 things that got broken, and you'll probably need to fix if you're planning on running it on beta 4. Okay? So thank you very much for staying till the end of the session. I see some of you had to catch the bus home probably. I won't say enjoy the rest of the conference because it's over unless you come into my workshop tomorrow. Thank you very much, and